Welcome to Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm Katie, and I'm a certified life coach, but I've also been a management consultant at McKinsey and a product manager at a tech startup. In other words, I know what it feels like to have a life that looks pretty good on paper, but doesn't feel as good as I want it to. I help my professional clients develop lives that are more meaningful, happy, and also more successful. And I want to share the same practical insights with you. Let's go. Hey everyone. On today's podcast, I am sharing an interview that I did with my client, Kara, about her experiences being coached. I love Kara's story because Kara came to coaching not because her life was absolutely terrible. In fact, it wasn't. In fact, she'd gone through more challenging periods in her past, probably from a divorce to a chronic illness for many, many years. And she did have a lot of things she really wanted in this moment, from a successful work life to a great partner to a much beloved child. But at the same time, she felt like there was a disconnect between some of her values on one hand and how she was actually spending her time and her brain space on the other hand. I think this is something that probably a lot of us can relate to. So our work together was really about helping her readjust both her thoughts and her actions so that she felt like her life did reflect what she valued most and did feel good to her on the inside, not just on paper. Kara is so funny and so smart and articulate, and she shares a bunch of really great lessons that she learned about how to cultivate a great life when you want a lot of big things for yourself. And she also shares some of her thoughts and experiences about what coaching is like from the client seat. And I think all of that will be helpful to so many of you. So without further ado, here is my interview with Kara. Okay, so I'm so excited to have you with me today, Kara. I wanted to start by just giving you a chance to introduce yourself to everyone listening. What should people know about who you are as a person?
Yeah, well, I feel like when I listen to a podcast, particularly when I'm trying to see what I might use from that podcast, I want to know as much as possible where I might find some areas of similarity. So I'll give you a few details about myself. I am 41 years old. I live in the Bay Area. I'm an executive coach and I run my own business. I'm also a fiction writer. And I am a mom of one daughter who's 6.5. And in about 6 weeks, I'm going to hopefully, if all goes well, have another daughter. A couple other things to know about me. For most of my parenthood, I've been a single parent. I was divorced when my daughter was a baby, and now I'm repartnered. So I have sort of a blended family.
Yeah. That's such a great introduction. I love your point about that. I think often when I'm listening, I'm how am I the same as this person?
Does this pertain to me at all, or should I turn it off right now? So those are a few things to get listeners going.
I love it. Okay. So my goal, as we talked about with these, is to hear more about your journey and sort of all the insights that you've had that you would put in different words than I could, that could be beneficial to everyone listening, to celebrate all that you did. And then also to give people insight into what it felt like to be coached, because a lot of people really have no idea. They don't know anyone who's been coached. They haven't been coached. So I want to sort of take everyone through the journey that you went through. So let's start with before we started working together. How were you feeling at the time? What made you think that this might be a good moment to be coached?
Yeah. So at that time, I felt pretty good about life, particularly on paper, and particularly compared to some trying periods I had previously experienced. So I mentioned a moment ago, I had navigated getting divorced, being a single mom. I also have a chronic illness that I've had for most of my life. So at first I thought to myself, my life is pretty good. Why do I need coaching? Why do I need improvement? As a coach myself, of course, I knew there was more to this question. Everything seemed like it was going well on the surface, but I still felt like there was a misalignment between the ways I was spending my thoughts, my energy, and my time, and what my real values were. And I said this to you, I think, many times in our work together, that I felt a sense of sort of misalignment between what I was doing and thinking every day and how I really wanted to be doing things and thinking things. So I knew I could feel better about my life and my choices.
I think that's such a great point too, because I think a lot of people can have that life that looks pretty good on paper, but we have this sense that something is off a little bit in terms of values. Yeah.
Right. And I think that a lot of us don't know exactly what resource to go to or whether there even is a resource for that. So many of us will look to a therapist, which is very helpful. I also see a therapist, but that's a little bit different because sometimes it's not actionable.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really about them giving you a space to talk, which is true in coaching too. But as a coach myself, I knew that it would be helpful to work with somebody really smart and compassionate to create some planfulness around this and also to get a different perspective on what might be contributing to this discomfort.
Well, and just because you brought it up, I want to go down the cul-de-sac briefly. Maybe you've already spoken to it, but I think a lot of people maybe have been in therapy or they know someone who's been in therapy and they're sort of like, how is it different? And you as a coach yourself know that there's so many kinds of coaching and so many kinds of therapy. So it's hard to give like 100% of an answer, but like, what has been your experience from the client seat in your specific circumstance about how it felt differently to be coached versus in therapy?
Yeah, well, I think one expectation that I have that's different between going into a coaching session and going into a therapy session is that the coach and the therapist are there to do different things. They're both there to empower you. They're both there to let you lead the way, but they have different training and also a different idea of what is a positive outcome. So, for example, when I go to my therapist, I may talk about really difficult, deep personal issues, maybe that even go beyond what I talk about here in coaching. But part of what she gives me is sort of a holistic view of how people think about these things in general, sometimes without asking me questions to push me further to think about those things differently. So there's a lot more directiveness and listening. Whereas in coaching, I think the idea is that you, as the person who's getting the coaching, should be doing most of the hard work. It sounds counterintuitive because you think to yourself, why am I paying someone else so that I can do all the hard work? But a good coach like you is going to be able to not only reposition things, but to get someone to think outside of the box of why they're thinking about some of these things. What other thoughts could they think if there were other thoughts like that? And to really sort of expand your viewpoint so that you have a plan for what you might do differently in the coming week or weeks.
Yeah. And given that you have to do all the work, like, is that just terrible? Do you hate it? Or like, is it, to what extent is it worth it?
Well, I've been on both sides of
that's why I asked. Yeah.
I know as a coach that the work that I do on your behalf, if I give you all the answers, those aren't going to be answers that are going to resonate with you, that are going to make you motivated and excited to take action. So you, Katie, could tell me, okay, Kara, here's what I think you should do in the following order. You should try this, this, and this. And most people as recipients of coaching will say, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I guess I could do that. But there's something in the process of making the realization about those things yourself that not only gives you an idea of what you could do next, but helps you replicate that process of realization again the next time. So it's not just about the idea you come up with, like the thing you're going to do next. It's also about how you come up with that. And when you're doing it yourself, just like when you're learning any new skill, that makes you better at it in the future.
Yeah, I think that's so great. That was such a great answer. You coach and you sit in the client seat. So I thought you would have, as you do, good thoughts on it. Okay. So I'll pull us back to the main focus. So that's how you were feeling before we started coaching. Did you have any thoughts before we started? And obviously you're a coach yourself, so it's a little bit of a different situation, but did you have any expectations about how coaching would be?
Well, it's interesting because you and I are different types of coaches. So, you introduce yourself as a life coach, which is a broad term for all the many things that you do. I introduced myself as an executive communication and leadership coach. So some of the issues we work on are different. Sometimes some of the people we work with are different. I had never done life coaching before. I didn't really know exactly how it would be different from my own practice. Part of my expectation was that I would be pushed. And because I knew you from before our initial consult, I knew that I would be pushed because you're so good at doing that and in such a compassionate and insightful way. I didn't know all of the different levers that one could pull within life coaching that might be different from the ones that I pull. And just to give you an example of one of the ones that we dipped into a little bit that was unusual for me was really sort of using the body and how you're feeling somatically to think about issues. That's something I don't do a lot of in my current practice, and maybe I should do more of now that I've experienced it now. But I wanted to be sort of pushed out of my comfort zone a little bit and to be sort of shaken up a little bit just to make sure that I was making the most of my opportunity to have new perspectives.
Yeah. Well, and can you speak a little bit more about, because we can sort of transition into like what coaching was like for you. Like, I think a lot of people, when they hear like we consulted the body, are sort of like, I don't need this, or like, what is this? I was just interviewing another client recently, and she was like, yeah, you like invited me to like feel my knees. It was like, people are going to be listening to this. They're thinking like, why are you doing that, Katie? So like, what was valuable to you about that experience?
Yeah. So a couple things. I think, first of all, anybody who knows me, who'll be listening to this podcast, would know that I come from a place of having a very strong bias toward the head.
Yeah.
Everything that I try to do, I do intellectually, thinking it out, coming up with a plan, coming up with new answers. And I haven't had a lot of experience or training with dipping into the body, which is actually very ironic, given that I've had a chronic illness for 30 years. And that a lot of my fiction writing is actually about the body. But when it comes to my own life or my own business, I don't go there that much. One of the reasons I think that I trusted you so much in this process was that I think you, first of all, I know you to be very smart and very critical in the ways that you approach things. And I knew that you would appreciate my hesitation for what it was, rather than a lack of openness to try it. What my experience was when I was able to try it was that those were the most sometimes confusing, but also emotional parts of our coaching.
Yeah.
Because it was so new, and it was almost like, going into a temperature of water that you've never felt before or something like that. I think that regardless of what we're skeptical of, there can be a lot of value in trying it. Whether it's, if you're coming from a somatic perspective, trying something that is more rational, or if you come from a perspective of, looking at one school of thought, trying another school of thought, just because that newness alone can give you a new perspective on how you feel. And I think tapping into my body as a resource to tell me what decisions felt right and wrong to me was something I've not experimented with before that was really valuable.
Yeah. And I just want to underline that, because I think a lot of people are like, why do we listen to the body? And it's like, it sounds like that ended up being the body gave you insight into actually decisions you wanted to make. Those were some of the biggest ahas for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think many listeners probably, when they're doing decision making, have done the coin flip test, not in the sense of like, oh, if it's heads, I'll do this. If it's tails, I'll do that. But how will I feel if it turns out to be heads? How will I feel if it turns out to be tails? But that's still something that's going on sort of in your mind, not in your body. And I feel like part of what you invited me to do was the sort of an analogy of closing your eyes and saying, imagine that it has flipped to heads. What's happening in your body right now? And that's a different way of approaching the same question that can give you more data.
Yeah, I love that, because your body's going to have a reaction, and that tells you a lot about how you actually feel. Yeah, that's great. Well, let's talk more about our coaching. Like, what were some of the things that you found to be really valuable or have stayed with you or changed your mind or felt like a blind spot that you feel like might be helpful to someone else listening?
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked a lot about was I came into this feeling like I had to choose between these three possible versions of myself. And I had these sort of three ideal personas, and I wanted to fully embody all of them, which I think any overachievers who are listening to this can probably relate to. So the three that I had sketched out were sort of the business boss, and I had other terms for that people can imagine. One was the art monster, and one was sort of the mom who's on top of momming, like the bountiful mother. And I really felt like these three areas of my life, my business, my artistic pursuits, and being a mom, are really important to me. And I just want to be like 1,000% in on all of them. And I was really struggling with how to manage all of these and how to think about myself and my identity with all of those things. And I was trying to either figure out a way to choose or to hybridize, and nothing felt quite right. And then you told me, I wrote this down because I found this really helpful. You said, you can have all three lives, but right now, by working through the struggle, you're not embodying any of those three. What would it look like if you were embodying any one of them? What would it feel like in your body? What do you really need to be doing to get that feeling? And I realized I wasn't really defining the terms for myself of what each of these buckets would look like. I wasn't breaking it down either into how I wanted to feel or what actions would get me those feelings. So to give you just one example, I had this idea that the bountiful mother, this like mother who has it all, cooks this amazing meal every night, because my own mother did that. I was very lucky. But honestly, at the end of the day, running a business, working on artistic projects, running a household, being a parent, I do not have it in me to cook a gourmet meal. I would love to tell people like, oh, I love to cook. And every night I could, I do like to cook, but honestly, not that much.
Yeah, that's real.
At the end of the day, not at all. Let's be real, like not at all. So, once I released that condition from the definition, it freed me up to have different expectations. Like maybe my definition of bountiful mother does not include being a gourmet chef every night. Yeah. What would that be like? And I think by allowing the terms to be sort of amorphous and undefined, I was letting a lot of other people's or sort of popular definitions of these terms come in and make the bar unattainably high for anybody.
Yeah.
And that sort of let me invest more in the things that felt possible to me in each of those three arenas.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you feel like changed in each of the three arenas? Or what else did you notice there? Because I know those were like the three, I was going to say arms of the stool, but that's not the word.
Yeah. Like the three pillars, the three pyramid or something. Yeah. I mean, I think the other thought error that I went in with was this very rigid way of thinking that because all three of these things are sort of core to my personality, that they all have to be primary at the same time. And I think one of the things that we talked about in our conversations was that there can be seasons where one of them is sort of the lead and one of them is sort of the cast member or whatever it might be, that I'm not going to be able, just in terms of hours in the day, to spend 24 hours a day on my business, 24 hours a day on my artistic pursuits, and 24 hours a day on momming. And especially given that I'm in a period of my life where I have one and soon to be two young children, that's always going to have to take up some portion of the time. I wouldn't want it to be otherwise.
Yeah.
But if I really wanted it to be otherwise or needed something to be primary, there's other things I could change. For example, for a season, I could get a little bit more help maybe, or ask my partner to help more. That things don't have to be permanent in terms of the way we cast these priorities was another big thing I walked away with.
Yeah. That things can, we talked a lot about seasons of like, what are your values and priorities for this particular season? Yep.
And I think it took a lot for me to accept that idea because I'm somebody who is very ambitious and holds myself to a very high standard. And I think a lot of us are like this, honestly.
Yep.
When you ask somebody, like, how much can you handle? Most of us will say, like, I can handle it all, Yeah. And maybe we could, but do we want to? What are the outcomes we're getting from doing that? I think that's a really good takeaway. And this season frame on the question helped me to understand that just because you're making a trade-off in the moment doesn't mean it has to be a permanent trade-off or the trade-off you would make the next time or the next season.
And what helped you, and maybe it's just in what you said, but be more okay with that? Because I think there are probably a lot of people listening who are trying to do this perfectionist thing of like attending to all the things at all the time and like might feel angry at the thought that there might need to be some trade-offs for a season.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we talked about were things like, what's most important to you right now? And often my answer was like a laundry list. And you would say, great. So if you were to choose two of those things from that list, what would those things be? And I was like, damn it, Katie. I think one of the things that helped me was realizing that all these things are important to me globally in terms of the person that I am. but they may not all have primacy in terms of their importance in the moment. So for example, right now, my kids are primary because one of them is like in utero, but my kid who is out of the utero is of utmost importance to me because she's 6 years old and she needs me. And that's a huge priority for me right now. When I think about my novel, for example, it's important to me to work on it, but is it important to me to complete it right now? What would I get from that situation if I were able to complete it that I don't have now? And is that thing something I really need for my calmness, for my happiness, for other things like that? Maybe not. So maybe I can pull back a little bit on that lever. But in terms of my business, that's important not only because it gives me energy and fulfillment, but also because that's how I pay my bills.
Yeah.
So, when we started to look at some of these things, it wasn't just what feels most important, but why is it important right now? Do those reasons feel like they match the season?
Yeah. Well, what I love about what you're saying, and I say this a lot, it's just like, you need to know your reasons, you need to like them.
Right.
And it sounds like you like your reasons at the end. You're like, my reasons match my values, and I like that.
Yeah. And I think that's something that is always changing for all of us. Like, we think about seasons very literally, like spring, summer, winter. I think a season can also be like a 2-week period.
Yes.
A season does not have to be like a 3-month commitment. It's just the moment in time where you are.
Yes.
And there's as much flexibility as you need there to be to rearrange those priorities.
Yeah. I love that insight of just like, you can have the priority for this period of time. And we know, right? When I ask you the question, what are the top, and you can hold that it could be different in 2 weeks, and that's totally fine. With obviously there's certain limitations around work or other things. You have the baby, you can't cancel that, but, and wouldn't want to, but that it can change. Yeah.
Right.
Well, tell me what else has sort of stayed with you that you feel like might be a benefit to someone listening?
Yeah. So, one thing that was a question you asked me that was really memorable was, what thoughts am I waiting to think until some milestone occurs? So one of the biggest struggles I have, and this is true of a lot of people I know, is that our biggest enemy is sort of the talk track in our heads. I can't have this. I am this. People are thinking that. And it ends up being incredibly painful for us because it's our own thoughts that are holding us back. There are thoughts that I knew I wanted to be thinking, but I was telling myself I couldn't think them until certain things were true. So to give you an example, I rent an apartment that does not have outdoor space and doesn't have guest rooms. So anyone listening in the Bay Area, hello, and solidarity. And sometimes I tell myself, I'm not a welcoming family member. I'm not creating a warm and open home life because I'm not giving my daughter a home where folks feel welcome to visit. Like, if my family comes from out of town, they cannot stay here, or they must stay on the floor or something like that. We don't really entertain because it's not that welcoming of a space to do that. But why am I waiting to tell myself that until I have outdoor space or a visitors to sleep, I don't have a welcoming family? Like, why will that change the way my daughter feels about how welcoming our family is? So I think we all look at the milestones other people have reached and tell ourselves that they feel a certain way or have a certain thing because of those milestones. But you really helped me reposition this as a chronic thinking error, that those milestones often don't correlate and more often don't have causation with the things that we want to feel and be. So who's to say if I had a guest room or like it's some outdoor space that I would suddenly be or feel welcoming? What else would it mean to feel that way? And I think, among these types of questions, like to question the things we say to ourselves and ask ourselves, what am I waiting for to change this thought? That was really eye-opening to me.
I love that because that's such a specific example of this idea that like you can actually change what you believe. You could change the belief, like, I don't have a welcoming family, if you wanted to. And a lot of people are like, what does that even mean? Like, you can't change what you think. It's just facts in your head. you know?
I think this is where the hypotheticals really come into play. And this is something I use in my own practice. But, I think you asked me a lot of hypothetical questions, like, just to give you one micro example from that scenario. Thanksgiving's coming up. We can't host here. Why not? Our table barely seats 4 people. So that's not going to work. So the types of hypothetical questions that I can imagine you asking me in that question would be to say, why not? What would it be like for you to host? What could you do to make it possible for you to host? I'm not saying you're going to, but what could you do? Let's just brainstorm. That's sort of one version of the hypothetical. And I think the other version is, what would it be like to feel like you are a welcoming family member who cannot host Thanksgiving?
Yeah. How are you still welcoming?
Right.
What are all the ways in which you're already welcoming?
And I think these hypothetical questions are really valuable because they break us out of what is into what could be. And the valuable thing of having a coach to partner with you on these things is that some of us may allow ourselves to think these hypothetical questions. And then we just go, yeah. And we go back to our old ways of thinking. But the coach will hold you there and make you answer the question. And I think that's part of the value of having this sort of accountability partner or guide along that path.
I think that's such a great point, because I think a lot of the things that people maybe even hear you say, they're like, oh, I would have thought of that myself, or like it would have occurred to me. And it's like, totally. I mean, most of my clients are incredibly resourceful, but it's like, there's something about like really being held in that space and have to have a whole conversation about the welcoming thing that can actually move you versus just be sort of a thought that comes in and leaves.
Yeah, that's right. I think, like you, most of the clients I work with are very talented, smart people who have their ish together, who could figure any of this out on their own, but often don't have the time or wherewithal to do it. And, one of, I think, the best things that you can hear as a coach is that you didn't tell somebody anything they didn't already know. You just helped them to see it for the first time. And I think that, given enough space and time and, maybe like a windowless room with nothing else to do, I could have thought of all these things, but I wouldn't have thought of all these things. And I wouldn't have allowed myself to take them to the furthest place I could. And that's where that partnership really holds tremendous value.
Oh, I love that. That's such a great point. Well, is there anything else that you feel like was valuable to you that you want to share with the people? I think one of the things that's helpful to think about before you go into coaching is what commitment you're going to make to yourself to try new things and to implement things in between the sessions. So just like anything else, when you're coaching, you're trying to think of, or you're receiving coaching, you're trying to figure out new ways of thinking and doing that give you outcomes that feel better to you. But just like when you're learning a language or an instrument or a sport, if you don't practice, nothing's going to happen. Yeah.
So two of the things. So there's one thing I think I did that was really valuable as the coachee, and one thing I think I could have improved on. As the coachee, I think I did a good job of being open, trying new things, like some of the somatic practices. And you were very gentle with me there. You could have pushed me harder, I know. But to the extent we dipped into it, I think I was open to trying it.
Yeah, I agree.
Here's where I could have done more. Every week you gave me homework to try. I do this with my clients too. And I don't do it to be mean. I do it because I know that if they're able to deliberately practice and integrate some of the things we work on, they'll build muscle memory around it and it won't be so effortful to pull it up. One of the things you encouraged me to do was to write morning pages. Did I write morning pages? I would say I wrote morning pages maybe 3% of the mornings. I thought about writing pages, but then did I do it? No, I played the Wordle or did some other thing. When I did do it though, what I was able to discover was actually a sense of huge relief because I was able to articulate to myself what was behind some of the things I was thinking. And I think that I could have potentially gotten even more out of this, even though I got so very much. by just coming up with a plan for myself of how I was going to do these things in between the sessions. So in terms of readiness to be coached, I think those are two good questions to ask yourself. How open am I to trying new things? In addition to, do I have a clear idea of what I really want to get out of it? But also, how much of a commitment am I willing to make to myself to try these things in between sessions so that I can make the most progress?
Yeah, I think all of that is so smart. I will also offer, though, which I often say, is sort of like, maybe you got all that you needed from what what you did. You know, I feel like I often have clients who just do not have capacity to do homework.
Oh,
and
for sure.
You know, and I respect that so much. And there's so much we can do in an actual session. So I also don't want people to be like, oh no, I don't have all these hours.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think like one thing to be clear about is when we think about homework, we're thinking about school where you actually have to carve out time that is outside of your normal life to do something. And the pages were sort of an example of something that veered into that territory. But there were also things that you offered me that I could do just in the course of a normal day. So things like, you know, when you think X, ask yourself why. I don't need to carve out time on my calendar to do things like that. I just need to have some sort of enough metacognition to tell myself, oh, this is the moment that Katie told me about. Now I'm going to try this different thing.
Yeah.
So I think just the awareness more than carving out time is really what's meant by the homework.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point. That's a great point of being like, I could get even more out of it if I can put in some of the metacognition, or sometimes there's a specific practice depending on the person.
Right. But I also just want to point out for listeners that what just happened there when I was like, I could have gotten more, I could have done more. And Katie said, what if you actually got everything you needed? That was it. That was like a coaching dynamic right there where I was leaning into my assumptions about being completist and being a perfectionist and doing all the homework. And Katie said, what if we shifted your thought? What would that be like? So right there, what you just experienced, that was like a little moment of coaching.
I know, I felt it as it happened. I was like, maybe I shouldn't coach Kara on this call. But yeah, I mean, my perspective is that you got everything that you needed. And that's a thought that I believe about our coaching engagement. So it's interesting. I would offer that to you, of like, even just post.
No, I do. I feel like and I'm a person, I know this about myself. Even if I feel like I got everything I needed from something, I'm always asking the question, but what more could I have done?
Yeah.
And that's a question that gets in my way quite a lot. I think it's true of all of us that what would it be like to be satisfied with a good outcome?
Yeah.
Rather than asking ourselves, how could I improve? We think about constant improvement as a value it's a very Western value. I mean, we can go way into the history of this. There's a lot of baggage around that. But, you know, it's a value that is not necessarily valuable.
Yeah. And like sometimes the striving for more results in less, right? Like we might have had to coach on you being tired all the time if you like tried to do all these things, you know?
Right. Exactly. You know, I'm glad that came up in our conversation so people could sort of see a little mini example of what might happen.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay. Just to close it out, what was noticeable to you about how you felt at the end of our time together? Sort of just like you described a bit at the beginning, we talked about the middle, like how did you feel differently at the end?
Yeah, I think I had a lot more space in my thoughts. So whereas at the beginning of the time, these thoughts that I was sharing with you and the listeners about who am I? Am I the art monster? Am I the boss lady? Am I these things were encroaching upon every action I took. I'd be like, well, here I am microwaving vegetables again. Guess I'm not a good mom. These types of talk tracks were really persistent. And I think one of the biggest takeaways I had was sort of the silence of those voices after our work together, because I was able to sort of categorize them for myself and better understand them so that I knew what I really wanted out of them. I also think that another takeaway, and I know you asked me how I felt, so I'm going to try to take this again out of the head and into the body.
Yeah.
But there's a sense of calm that you get, I think, in your body when you realize that you have options. And I think that a lot of the time we take the thoughts that we have as truths and we say, well, that's my thought. That's it. That's what I've got. And I've got to just wrestle that alligator. Knowing that you have options feels lighter in your body, at least to me. Knowing that that thought could be changed, or that you could question that thought or reposition that thought, feels lighter. And so I think there was a lot of heaviness I was able to let go of as a result of our conversations.
That lands in my body when you say that, Kara. I love it.
In the body, folks. In the body.
Okay, beautiful. Well, yeah, this was great. Is there anything last that you want to leave people with? Like a last insight that you felt like would be useful to somebody listening to this, or insight about what coaching is like, or anything else?
Yeah, I will say something. And this is probably going to embarrass you, and probably not the reason that you wanted to have this conversation, but I do want to say this. I have been coaching for about 15 years. I have never really engaged in a coaching engagement before this that was for me as a person, rather than me as some sort of professional development. I found this tremendously valuable. And I think part of the reason is that I sensed in Katie from our initial conversations, a lot of wisdom, flexibility, compassion that is really rare among the hundreds of coaches I have met in my career. So I would say that coaching, I think, is valuable for anybody who's considering it, but also make sure that you find a coach that really resonates with you. Talk to lots of coaches, see whose approaches appeal to you, see who you like talking to, see if you come up with new ideas when you're speaking to them. Of course, I think Katie is the best. But I also think it's a good idea to just feel out for yourself, where are you going to get the most from those conversations?
Oh, I love that so much. I mean, such kind words, and such an honor, and coming from you especially. And I think you're so right. It's all about fit. You got to feel like that person really resonates with you. And that's going to be where a lot of the value comes.
Right. If you ever see, there are a lot of people on their LinkedIn or whatever will say like #1 coach in the world. Says who? No. #1 coach in the world just means #1 coach in the world for you. The person who's there to meet you at that time for your needs. And there are different coaches that are right for you based on different priorities, different seasons, so to speak, different things you're working on. So for this moment, for the things you want to work on, who is going to be the right partner for you for that collaboration? I think that's the question to ask.
This is going to be a great one. I think you're going to help a lot of people, Kara. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, thanks for having me. And thank you for all the tremendous coaching.
Anytime.
If you really want to change in a meaningful, lasting way, that's when you need a life coach. Every client I've worked with has had incredibly personalized reasons why they're in the tired or anxious or stuck or uninspired state they're in. Working with me can help you identify those roadblocks, which are usually blind spots that you genuinely cannot see, and implement a profoundly customized, doable plan for overcoming them. I have a very small, high-end, one-on-one coaching practice. If you'd like to be my next client, reach out at katiesiever.com. I'd love to meet you.